Hello, everybody, and welcome to your Ruby Live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby. And I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses, along with my other colleagues on our instructional team. And today I want to welcome you to my office hours. This is your opportunity to ask questions related to food and cooking and my chance to do my best to answer those questions. Okay. As we get started, I want to mention just a couple of housekeeping tips. And the first one is as you ask questions, please keep those focused on the realm of food and cooking rather than straying into the topics of medicine or nutrition or other broader fields, let's say. And then if indeed you do want to participate a little bit more closely, by submitting a question or a comment, you're welcome to do so by looking to the right, the upper right of your screen where you'll see a dialog box, and you can go ahead and type in that question, and that'll make its way to the queue. And the queue is that list of questions you already see entered on the right-hand side of your page. And the last thing I want to mention is that as you look at the questions that are already populated, you'll notice in the individual question box a heart-shaped icon. If you would like me to address that topic sooner than later, go ahead and click on that icon, and it'll push that item up in priority. Okay. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with today's questions. And the first one is from Jane, who says, I will be starting to teach plant-based classes soon, virtually, and hopefully in person. Do you have a recommendation to where to get liability insurance? Aha. An interesting question. This, however, falls outside of our domain here. I would suggest a couple of things. One would be to reach out to whoever handles your insurance right now, whether it's your homeowner's insurance or auto insurance, and talk to them about this topic of business related liability insurance. Now, the other idea is to look online and to see if you might find a forum or otherwise some information that might direct you to a company that might specialize in this sort of space, right? Entrepreneurs doing cooking, or other performance art as it goes. And just follow the trail, and I think you'll find something. Thank you. All right, and the next question is from Patty, who writes, I've noticed that many people submit their photos for class assignments with a block of 4 photos. Since I'm alone and take many of my pictures with one hand, and assignments occasionally would benefit from a couple of views for the prep, how is it done? So I believe what you are referring to are student photos where the student has utilized a collage app. And there are a number of them online, many of them free of charge. And in fact, right now on your screen on the right side, you'll see a few examples. And thank you, Patrick, for uploading those. So Patty and others, please take note. First, I'll say that, as you know, our assignments are formatted and designed for a single image upload, in a given slot. And the important accompanying part to that is your description, your rich description of what's going on. And it's important, of course, to follow closely with the instructions, as they do differ a bit from assignment to assignment, where in some cases we're very specific about what it is that we would like you to capture in your photograph. And other times the directions are more general, where we ask you to choose, for example, a key interim step or in process step, one that you think is important to what it is that you're preparing. Okay. And that combination, in other words, one photograph and rich description, is adequate for us, for the members of our instructional team to see what's going on and to understand your comprehension of what you're doing and what's happening, okay, at that stage. Now, um, it's the description is pretty important. Okay, so do take the time to look at our. Many times you'll see an accompanying list of vocabulary to use to describe food smells and tastes and textures. Start to practice that new language. That's what we're talking about here. It really is a new language of the kitchen, and it takes some practice. And so, really, that description is going to be very important for you in developing your appreciation and understanding and ability to think about and to talk about food, and of course to communicate that experience with us. Okay, if you do decide to use a photo collage, please limit your photos to a maximum of 2 images per upload. Okay. Um, Very often, when more than 2 images are included, in a single collage and single upload, then the images themselves become too small for us to see the details of your good work. Okay, in which case, we're in a position to deduct points, or in some cases to ask the student to redo the assignment or that part of the assignment, which usually means redoing the assignment, right? Because it's part of a cooking process. So please understand that our goal, right, mutually here, is to take a photograph, capture an image that shows clarity, with good lighting, that's at a good distance, to highlight the details of what it is that you're discussing in your description and what we asked to be shown. Okay, that's most important. Okay, so please don't upload 3 or 4 or more images in a single upload, but limit it to 2 if you use a collage app. Thank you. And the next question is from Darlene, who writes, I purchased dried mushrooms for convenience. I find that after soaking in water for several hours, they are still chewy or tough. Are there some hidden secrets for making them moist and soft? Typically, I use shiitake and oyster dried mushrooms for cooking. This is a great question, Darlene. And the quick answer is that no, there aren't any tips or secrets or chef hints to share with you. Rather, the drying process, the dehydration process, changes the structure of the food in question, such that when we rehydrate that food, it will not revert to its original state. Okay, and so the result indeed is a chewier, more firm, to call it tough, finished product. And of course, cooking will soften that up to some extent, but it's still going to have that sort of a texture, and it will not revert to that more succulent, soft texture of the fresh product. Okay, it has been fundamentally changed through the dehydration process. Thank you. And the next question. When washing herbs like cilantro or parsley, is it best to wait until it is dry before chopping? I blot with paper towel, but wondered if it is better to shake, spin, or air dry. I think that it really depends on what you want to do with that product. Okay, if the item is going directly into the food, the dish that you've made, and it's being folded in or or stirred in, then it doesn't matter if it's wet when it's chopped. On the other hand, if you're using these items as a garnish, then to dry the product will yield herbs that are lighter and fluffier and less likely to clump together, and they will look more attractive when used as a garnish. And the drying process, I think, can follow different paths as you have suggested, whether it's shaking them off or using a salad spinner or simply letting them sit out to air dry. But those are the two broad scenarios that come to mind that would dictate the need to dry or not. Thank you. Hi, Paul. How are you? Paul says, I want to know if you have any tips for cooking with jackfruit. I made a burger the other day and found that it was extremely mushy. Well, the general tips for jackfruit, in this context, typically in a savory context, would be to use green jackfruit, which has more of a savory flavor. That is to say, less sweetness has developed, and then also a firmer texture. Okay, and then the jackfruit can be cooked, often partially cooked or par cooked, whether it's sauteing or sometimes it's baked in the oven once it's pulled apart. It could be steamed. And then it's seasoned, and then you kind of follow through with whatever process you're working with, or whether it's combining with other binding ingredients to make a burger patty, or you're making a saute or something else. But so there's the goal is to try to, of course, to maintain the integrity of the firmer fiber and structure of the underripe fruit, and so avoiding ripe fruit is going to be part of that equation, and then to avoid overcooking is going to be part of that as well. But also I would say that as you make a burger patty that's made from jackfruit or any other plant-based whole food ingredient that I can think of, let's try not to compare it to a meat-based patty. The structure of a plant-based patty is going to be softer. The protein and just the fleshy material of the meat, the ground meat in a meat-based patty, becomes very firm, and that's a mental transition, largely speaking, that many of us need to make as we transition to the plant-based equivalent, I'll say, in terms of a burger patty. Okay. So it's not going to be, regardless of how green, in this case, the jackfruit might be, it's not going to be as firm as a meat-based patty. Thank you. And next up from Maryland. How long do you generally store cooked food in the fridge? Is there a good way to revitalize its appearance before serving? So this is a broad question. This is a simple question, but a big question, because it really depends on what we're talking about. And let me start with the category that's probably most commonly, addressed here, and that is the typical leftover food from a previous meal. Okay, in which case, generally speaking, the shelf life under refrigeration is about a week. And so we're talking about 7 days. Okay, but do understand that it can be more than that, or it can be less than that, depending on a number of variables. And the variables include the food item itself. Some things, such as legumes, often have a slightly shorter shelf life, maybe 6, 5, or 4 days, for example. Sometimes 7 days, sometimes more, but very often a little bit less than that is going to be a safer approach when handling legumes. They tend to be fairly perishable. Other things that are a little bit drier and just other things, let's say, that are left over. Maybe it's pasta. Those things can certainly get to a week, sometimes a little bit more. Other variables include the temperature of your refrigerator. Is it set at 41 degrees or is it set at 37 degrees? That small spread of, in this case, 4 degrees Fahrenheit can result in quite a few hours or even a few days difference, again, depending on the food product and other variables. Another thing to keep in mind is just where in the refrigerator the food item is placed. Things that are in the door or very close to the opening of the door will have a shorter shelf life versus an item that is placed further back in the refrigerator. It's just simply colder back there and consistently colder. Think about as we open the garage door, or not the garage door, the refrigerator door, each time a little bit of warm air gets in, a little bit of that cool air escapes, and the temperature increases just a touch. And so all of those little shifts in temperature will decrease the shelf life of foods that are placed in that zone, which is close to the door or in the door itself. Okay. It's very important because there are so many variables that we as consumers practice recognizing foods that are good or not so good to eat. Okay. I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. All right. So on one hand, there are pathogens. And in our food safety and sanitation unit or short courses, and this is going to be true at any culinary school, the emphasis is usually on pathogens. And these are disease-causing microorganisms. And so much time is spent on emphasizing pathogens because the results can be dire. Ranging from very simple tummy ache and diarrhea to death. And yet, really, the chances of getting caught up with a pathogen are relatively small when we step back and look at the bigger picture of food that goes bad. Okay, or maybe I should say bad food. Now, the other category that I want to address here is spoilage bacteria. Okay, and this is going to be much more common. And spoilage bacteria simply refers to the common bacteria or other microorganisms. It could be mold or yeast, right? It could be other such things that are in our air, right? On our fingers, just in our environment, naturally, and that's just the way it is. This is by and large what we're trying to control. Okay, when we talk about how long do things last in the refrigerator, if you can keep your items cool and not handle them so much, with your fingers, your hands. Also, keep your saliva out of the containers because saliva has enzymes that will start the digestive process and will quickly or more quickly start to break down food. So if we keep the food as clean as we can, then we can maximize the shelf life. Okay, but also keep in mind fundamentally that when we're dealing with the first steps of cooking, we have fresh food, we prepare a dish. That's really when that item is in its optimal state, okay, of quality in all respects. And as we put it in the refrigerator, it's going through an aging process. And so this idea of trying to keep food or wondering, just what the maximum shelf life of food is an effort of trying to preserve old food. Okay, think about that. So let's do our best to cook quantities that are most appropriate for our setting. And if you have really an abundance of food, then maybe the freezer, right, is a good place to think about storing food, because we can then extend the shelf life into weeks and months. But the refrigerator, I would say really try to eat things up within a couple of days in order to enjoy the food at its freshest. Okay. Now, the second part of your question, Marilyn, says, is there a good way to revitalize its appearance before serving? And here it really depends on what it is. Okay. Sometimes if it's, well, let's say as an example, um, it's a parsley salad. Okay. I mean, in that case, perhaps just sort of tossing the item, with a spoon to sort of fluff it up a little bit will do the job. In some cases, if we have a lot of vegetable matter in the salad, the water will be drawn out as it sits in the refrigerator, in contact with mayonnaise or mustard or vinegar or olive oil or whatever else you have in that dish. In that case, maybe to quickly strain that food to get rid of the excess liquid is the best thing to do. Okay. Um, in other cases, maybe it's appropriate to um, dress it with a fresh batch of sauce that you had originally paired with that dish, but just a fresh batch to make that dish look fresh again. So those are a few examples that come to mind, but I'm sure there are just many, many other ways to handle different foods depending on what it is we're talking about. Okay, thank you. All right, next up from Tammy. When making stock from vegetable scraps, what is the ratio of seasonings to give the most flavorful result? Are there any vegetables or seasonings to limit or not use because they give the stock a funky flavor? So, uh, yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, I'll have to take a look at the lesson real quick to give you a specific ratio in terms of a starting point. But, generally speaking, we're talking about an amount of mirepoix. If we're talking about as a starting point, mirepoix is the onions, carrots, and celery that make up, in the classical Euro-American kitchen anyway, the aromatic component of a stock. Okay, and meat stock comes to mind, where we might be using bones from an animal or seafood of some sort. In that case, the mirepoix would be comparable in amount to the bones that are used, but this can be adjusted. Okay, when we talk about these sort of ratios, they are like any other recipe, a starting point. And it's one where we always advise students to do it at least a couple of times, if not many more times, to really understand the process and how the functions of heat and time affect the different ingredients that are at play, in order to learn about the cooking process and learn about ingredients. And again, learn about the effects of temperature and time, okay, which are the fundamental components of cooking in most cases. And then make changes, right? You own the process, you own your experience at that point, and have fun with adjusting those ingredients one way or another. You can omit ingredients, you can add entirely new ingredients that you would like, based upon your personal palate preference or perhaps the preferences of your audience, as well as what makes sense with the food that ultimately this stock will be paired with. Okay. And so you use the word seasonings here, ratio of seasonings. So I'm going to drill down to the next layer of aromatics, and where I think about spices and herbs. In which case, this is really going to be up to you. Okay, start with a recipe. Okay. And as I just said, make it at least a couple of times to begin to understand it, and then start to make some adjustments that suit your preference. And so that could mean adding some entirely different things like fresh chilies, dried chilies. Maybe it's a fistful of garlic. Maybe it's um, uh, um, other herbs, maybe it's lemongrass, kaffir lime leaves, if you want to take the stock into the direction of a Southeast Asian flavor profile. This is all within your control, once you understand that process. Okay. And do this to taste during the simmering process, because some things, for example, citrus rind, even lemongrass, and some of these very pungent items can become out of balance if they're allowed to simmer too long. And so, when you're simmering across 2 or 3 or 4 hours or sometimes more, you need to be nearby during these early experimental stages when you're getting to know the process and you're making changes, because you are in charge at that point. Okay. And so think about regional cuisines around the world, and again, what you might pair the stock with to inform what seasonings or flavorings you might add, right, or adjust in the stock. Okay. And the second part of your question, are there any vegetables or seasonings to limit or not use because they give the stock a funky flavor? So let me, first say that it depends on what it is that you're creating, and just oftentimes what sort of clarity that you want in the stock. If you're after a very clear stock, then avoid particularly starchy ingredients. And oftentimes we avoid potatoes for this reason. But other times the clarity of the stock doesn't make any difference, because you're going to end up making some sort of a stew, or with a dark gravy, or an opaque cream of soup. And so the look of the stock is not important, in which case you can add anything you want to it. Now, in terms of funky flavor, I mentioned that some ingredients become particularly pungent and might lend, in particular, bitterness, can be noticeable and offensive. But otherwise, the flavors are going to be up to you and what you think funky means. Okay. Because, our palates differ, and our objectives differ in terms of how we would use that stock. Okay. So take notes along the way. I'm a big fan of having a notebook and a pencil in the kitchen, so I can jot down notes, because I never remember them 3 hours later. And then continue to experiment. It's an ongoing process. I keep a notebook in the kitchen at all times, so I can just pick it up and refer to what I was doing 10 days ago, without having to stop and try to rely upon my memory. So anyway, have some fun with the process. This is cooking. And let me add one more thing. This is also why at Rouxbe, we do not rely on recipes. We do not emphasize recipes as the first line of approach when it comes to cooking. Instead, we are teaching you cooking methods and the ancillary techniques that are part of this broader process of cooking. And once you gain confidence, understanding of these methods and techniques, then you can handle any recipe that's given to you. Okay. And that's the beauty of this approach. And so when you see a stock recipe, after you have some experience under your belt, you can read through it and you will understand what the author is intending in most cases. Now, sometimes you still may want to try it out once or twice to understand what the author is intending, if it's something new to you. But at that point, you'll have a pretty good grasp and you'll be able to go down your own path. All right. So again, have fun with it. Thank you. All right, next up from Yvonne. What are the best things to store in the refrigerator door? I tend to have my dressings, nuts, seeds, fruit paste, and jams, and some beverages on the door, and the leftovers on the shelves of the refrigerator itself. Just checking to be sure. Yvonne, what you described is my refrigerator. I think you are spot on, and that's reasonable. I think very often the condiments things in jars and bottles often have ingredients that extend the shelf life. And these jams and things that you talk about have sugars or vinegars and again, things that tend to inhibit spoilage or extend the shelf life. So having them in the door is not an issue. Right. Whereas the daily leftovers would benefit from some cooler temperatures deeper in the refrigerator. Thank you. And Marilyn says, it seemed on the videos on slicing that the knife was in right hand and in some videos in left hand. Am I cross-eyed? Um, well, Marilyn, you are correct. Not about the cross-eyed part, but about the knife being in the left hand or the right hand, as we have some different folks demonstrating knife cuts depending on what it is that you're watching. And after all, there are left-handed cooks and right-handed cooks out there. And so we do present a couple of different options. But for the individual cook, including you, Marilyn, the norm is to hold the knife in your dominant hand and to move through the motions of slicing and dicing. Okay. Some of us are ambidextrous and we can juggle knives in both hands, but for most of us, we pick a hand and it's our dominant hand and we work with that one. Thank you. All right, next up. Always wondering if certain veggies clash with each other for cooking. Will their nutrients cancel out each other, or even worse, will that dish cause harm to the one who eats it? A lot of time I put together different types of veggies. Now, this is an interesting question. It definitely falls outside of the domain of cooking per se, and really gets us into a realm of food science and nutrition. And so let me answer this first by saying that I have never heard of nutrients canceling out each other. So please consider reaching out to a dietitian and or a food scientist, perhaps at a local university. And you can also try a search to see if there might be some scholarly articles on this sort of a topic. And if you don't have access to a search engine at home, then consider reaching out to your public library, which often does have a subscription to a database that will, might help you access scholarly articles in this realm. Thank you. All right, next up. How can we size down a recipe for a single eater rather than for multitudes while maintaining flavors? I discovered that it isn't just math. Aha. So yes, good insight, Lynn. Let's start with this. To begin with, it's typically safe. I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm talking about recipes in general. I mean, even baking in this case. So just recipes in general. Start by cutting it in half. Okay, so if you're talking about a typical home recipe, it's going to feed maybe 4 to 6 people, let's say. And if you cut that in half, you're going to get a yield of 2 to 3 people approximately. Okay, so that's going to get us closer to a single eater quantity, but that's going to be a good way to start. Now, as we start to cut down even further, then it becomes necessary to start to adjust the herbs and spices and other flavorings that are usually used in small quantities. And I think in particularly spices, because many of them are, they're strong, they're pungent in flavor. And we need to make an adjustment to taste in that situation. Okay, so when it comes to the main ingredients, start by cutting them in half. And actually, all ingredients, cut them in half. And then beyond that, if you want to further reduce a recipe, you might try cutting it in half again. But again, those those smaller quantity, more intensely flavored ingredients will have to be adjusted to taste. And so this is where you put on your experimental cook hat and pull out your notebook and pencil and really take some notes and understand that this could be, a multi-day or multi-week experiment, depending on just how frequently you want to address that recipe and tinker with it. Okay. But that's the process. There's really no other shortcut. I think, even for R&D, research and development chefs, that's what we do when those instances come up, or otherwise when we're creating new recipes or adjusting recipes to make it our own. This is a very similar process that takes place in all of those scenarios. Thank you. All right, next up, what are some tips for shipping perishables to keep cold and intact? Is shipping perishables worth the cost as a business? Cynthia, this is an interesting question. So tips for shipping perishables, this is another question that kind of falls outside the purview of cooking per se. It gets into a specialty topic here of shipping, packaging, and shipping. Now, when I've received perishable foods, it really it depends on what sort of an infrastructure you're dealing with. Okay, it depends on the food item, and it probably even depends on local laws or regulations in terms of maintaining food safety. So there's some variables to consider here, but you've got those cool packs that you can throw in the freezer, that can be used to keep an item cold. There's dry ice that I have seen used. I've even seen certain foods packed in sawdust and then shipped across some distance. So there's some different technologies out there, but I would recommend that you reach out, to Dr. Google and do a search on the food packaging and shipping industry, because this, like I said, gets beyond our domain of cooking here at Rouxbe. A very interesting question, however. And then you asked the question, is shipping perishables worth the cost as a business? And I think this really depends on your business plan and what it is that you're doing. And if you don't have a business plan, I'm a big fan of business plans, and I always suggest that students take the time to put together a business plan for their entrepreneurial idea. And one place to start is at score.org. That's SCORE, score.org, where you can find a lot of guidance on starting a small business, as well as how to put together a business plan. And it's within that context that you can start to investigate and calculate and play with different scenarios and figure out if shipping perishables is worth it, however you define worth it. Okay. So that's my recommendation for you. Thank you. And Annette says, what's your favorite food processor? Well, that's a good question. For the longest time, I'm sorry, Annette, let me, before I answer your question, I just want to acknowledge that Patrick just posted a link to score.org. Thank you very much, Patrick. Back to Annette. For most of my life, I have used Cuisinart food processors, and I've been pleased with those. Maybe that's all I can say, really. I'm not necessarily familiar with all of their latest products, so I hesitate to comment on them. But that would be a place to start, at least based upon my experience. Thank you. And hello, Julietta. Nice to see you back. And Julietta writes, any extra tips for making kombucha? Just got a SCOBY from a neighbor to try. Can I use dates for sweetener? I don't have probably any additional tips beyond what you might see in our lesson. There's certainly some information online that you can tap into. Sweeteners of different sorts can be used, okay, including dried fruit. But again, if you want a little preview, I recommend doing a little bit of reading online to see what other people have experienced, okay, in that category. Thank you. And then Soma writes, following up on the mushroom question, after soaking to reconstitute, how can water be used? Is it worth freezing? Is it truly safe to consume? Um, so the water, mushroom water, right? That is the byproduct of reconstituting dried mushrooms, is very flavorful, and it can be used any place you want a flavorful liquid. Think about how you might use stock, but in this case, with a probably a more concentrated flavor profile, right? That's aligned with mushrooms. But of course, you can change the quantity. Um, you can use the mushroom water in soups and stews, and again, different places where you might need or want a flavorful liquid. Okay, you could go into making a dough, a bread dough of some sort if you wanted to, for example. Is it worth freezing? It's worth freezing if you place value on that product. We will very often freeze stock because we find value in that flavorful liquid. So if you value the flavor of the mushroom water, then sure, consider freezing it and using it in your cooking. Excuse me, just a moment. And then the last part of your question is it truly safe to consume? And uh, well, I don't know why it wouldn't be necessarily, but if you have if you have a specific concern, you might want to send a sample to a lab and have them test it for whatever they might test it for, or whatever you might have a concern for. Um, you might again refer to Dr. Google, do some searching, and see if you can find any concerns around mushroom water. No concerns come to mind necessarily for me. But again, take a look at that if that concerns you. Thank you. And Julietta writes, I cannot find wonton wrappers. Is there any advice on how to make them myself thin without a pasta thing? To hand roll, pot sticker wrappers or wonton wrappers, is a great exercise, and with the right dough consistency and ample practice, you can get them to be pretty thin. And so that's my advice there. I don't have a recipe or a formula for the dough off the top of my head, but you can probably do some searching and find a dough that would be suitable for rolling out pretty thin. Um, I I have seen that done in restaurants, that hand make these sorts of dumplings. But again, it is going to come down to the constitution of the dough itself. All right. And like I said, lots of practice. Thank you. Next up, we'll be learning to combine spices and veggies in the FOK course for more exciting meals. As you move through our courses, including the FOK Ultimate course, we do talk about herbs and spices, and we do have, a number of practice recipes that are included that incorporate spices. And this is a great starting point. The next thing to do is read. And, I would recommend that you might pick up a reference book of some sort, one that focuses on spices in the context of global cookery, so that you can start to learn about combinations of flavors or spices that make sense, that have a historical precedence, and practice with those. And then you can start to sort of tinker and create on your own as that following step. All right, thank you. And Yvonne is back with a follow-up here. Yvonne says, oh, in light of the mushroom broth, water, question, can the bean broth also be saved and used like vegetable broth in soups or in any other cooking needs? The quick answer is yes. For the bean water, there's often more residual carbohydrates from the beans, and these longer chain saccharides that can be a concern for some folks, usually in terms of flatulence. But I have used bean water myself, and I know folks that do. And so you can, when you're cooking beans, you can add things like asafoetida, for example, or epazote. There are probably some like kombu. These are ingredients that are said to reduce the incidence of flatulence resulting from beans. And in this case, that would probably affect the bean water to some extent as well. But this would vary from person to person, of course. Okay, but experiment and see what you come up with. Thank you. All right, Paul says, any tips with cooking with tofu? I tried straining the liquid from the package and swapped it out for a non-chicken broth along with a few seasonings. I found that the flavors were not absorbed into the tofu. Is it worth marinating the tofu or season as I go? Okay, yes. So, if you want some deeper flavor penetration, what you can do is consider a firmer textured tofu. There's a firm or even an extra firm tofu, which gives you a particular texture that often can mimic chicken or something that we're trying to replicate in a plant-based form, and then marinate it. You can marinate it overnight or multiple nights, and experiment with it. Right, as the penetration rates will vary depending on the style of tofu. Medium, firm, extra firm, for example. As well as the marinade solution itself. How concentrated it is, perhaps even what else is in that mixture. If you happen to have a vacuum sealer sort of a device and you seal the marinating liquid and the tofu in a vacuum pack, then those flavors will be drawn into the tofu even quicker and deeper. And so that's another way to go about that. Okay. And then you can always season on top of that as well, adjust seasoning. You can add more of a similar flavoring or add a contrasting flavoring, during the cooking process to create these layers of flavor or flavor intensity for more interest and satisfaction, while you're eating the finished dish. Okay. Give that a try. I guess, I'm reviewing your question here, and you start out by talking about straining the liquid. For these firmer styles of tofu that can handle some pressing, I would recommend step number one to be pressing some of the liquid out of the tofu, and then that will help the absorption of the marinade as well. Okay. So give that a try, and I'm certain that you're bound to find some satisfaction in there. Thank you. All right, next question. The plastic drawer at the bottom of my refrigerator is not marked as to its function, nor does it have controls. What is the function of such a drawer? What is the ideal optimal use for it? The drawers, I'll tell you what's in my drawers, refrigerator drawers. At the bottom there, I've got some root vegetables in them. And I think I've got a container of ginger root. Um, and I see people that use the drawers for a number of different things. It could be herbs, it could be other vegetables that are not root vegetables. So, potentially it could be anything. Note that in some cases, the drawer may have a little tab that slides that will open or close little ventilation holes, and that can help control the humidity inside the drawer. Um, uh, Also, the quality of the food in the drawers and in the refrigerator in general will also vary depending on how it's individually packaged or wrapped or cared for. So keep in mind that fundamentally the refrigerator as a box is designed to draw out moisture. And so foods go through a slow dehydration process. And I think you have probably noticed that, right? If you put some leftover food in the fridge that's uncovered, it'll develop a little dry crust right after a couple of hours or a couple of days. And that's indicative of the dehydration process. If you put a bell pepper in the fridge, after a day or two, it develops very light wrinkles on the surface and becomes a little bit softer as the moisture is drawn out. And so often it's desirable, whether using the drawers or the larger compartment, to put produce, in another container of some sort. And it might be a solid container, or it could be a very breathable bag. It could be a paper bag. It could be some sort of a plastic bag, but something that can protect the produce to mitigate the dehydration process to some extent. Now, another consideration is to line the bottom of that drawer with a lightly dampened towel, which will introduce a little bit of moisture to that space if that's what you want, if that will benefit the products that go into that drawer. Okay. Sometimes, for example, with herbs, we might choose to wrap the bunch of herbs in a lightly dampened towel, whether paper or cloth, in order to slow down the wilting process. Wilting is dehydrating. And so if we can introduce some moisture via a towel, then we can often prolong the shelf life of that bunch of herbs. Okay. And so those are some things that come to mind for refrigerators in general and the drawers specifically. And, is there an ideal optimal use for them? Probably not. Okay. In fact, as I say this, I can think of yet another sort of a bottom drawer we have that has nuts and seeds in it. And so, feel free to experiment. Again, have that notebook, in your kitchen and jot down what it is that you're doing, so you can find the best practice for you over a period of time. Thank you. And Yvonne says, "Oh, Paul, definitely make the sweet and sour tofu here in the Rouxbe course. Their marinade is great." Thank you for that plug, Yvonne. And I would agree. Paul, give that a try. And it'll not only, I think, produce a nice food item for a meal, but it'll start to give you an idea of how to handle tofu in a certain way and how to work with certain concentrations of marinade. And then you can make alterations to that given marinade recipe to change the flavor profile in one direction or another. All right. And then with that same recipe, try using different styles of tofu, the medium or firm or extra firm, for example, and you'll have some slightly different results as well. Thank you. And thank you, Patrick, for posting that sweet and sour tofu recipe for us. Next up from Cynthia, Follow up on mushroom stock. I've not used the dried mushrooms yet, but your answer makes me think that liquid might be a nice base stock in simmering and cooking some softer tofu to absorb that flavor. Am I correct in this thinking? Absolutely, Cynthia. That sounds like a wonderful way to go forward with the mushroom stock, or I guess it'd be soaking liquid, whatever you want to call it. That sounds like a great outlet. Thank you. And Lily writes, what is the best way to store ginger and turmeric roots? I have had pretty good success storing these, in the fridge. This is where one of those drawers comes in handy. Now, the other part of this is to use these items pretty quickly, because they will start to lose moisture, and they start to shrivel up on you. And then another thing is, they will start to grow mold. And in the case of mold, trim it off, scrub it off. Oftentimes it's on the surface with the skin, and you can just kind of peel off all that and still use the product. It's quite fine, at least uh, in my home. But that's what comes to mind for me. The thing with food is it's best when it's eaten fresh, which means sooner the better. And if you can buy smaller quantities to avoid the longer term degradation of quality, then your results are going to be better, in my opinion. Okay, thank you. And then last up for today's office hour is from Cynthia, who writes, hi, Eric. Could you give some feedback on the importance or need to soak grains before cooking them? Now, which ones? I do soak steel cut oats. I'm experimenting with some whole grains. Thank you. This program is so helpful. I'm thrilled I joined. First of all, thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate your enthusiasm and your positive feedback on your experience in the course and with Ruby in general. And I certainly hope that's the case with all of you out there. But regarding grains, generally speaking, if we're talking about whole grains, it is helpful to soak them. It just it speeds up the water absorption process a little bit, and it does so in a gentle manner. And grains as well as legumes, can be soaked for a pretty long period of time. Many recipes will say soak for a few hours or soak overnight. But if it turns out that you can't get to your grains for another 3, 4, 5, 6 days, that's fine. Just put them in the fridge. And, after a couple of days, anyway, certainly refresh the water each day. That's very helpful in extending the shelf life. Okay. Otherwise, follow the guidelines of whatever it is that you're making. Okay. In some cases, a soak may not be recommended depending on what it is that you're making. It can affect the texture. If you want a firmer texture, maybe you just throw it in the pot and you start your simmering process. Some of this is also culturally mitigated, where in certain parts of the world, grains are handled in a certain way, but in other regions, they're handled differently. So keep an open mind. In the world of cooking, there often is more than one way to do it right. And much of that can be accessed through your own experimentation, and as well as, of course, reading books and information that has already been published on the topic. But don't be afraid to then make changes yourself, right? As I mentioned early on in today's program, after you make a recipe, let's say a couple of times, then it's yours. I mean, you had the experience to tinker with it, and feel free to do so, whether it's through ingredients or through the cooking time or temperature or volume of liquid. Whatever it is that you want to tinker with, let your curiosity guide you, and you'll come up with some very interesting results that can be applied in different scenarios. Okay. And that certainly holds true with whole grains. All right. Um, Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate your interaction, and we had a beautiful list of questions and comments, and even interactions between audience members today, which is so nice to see. I'll be back again and look forward to seeing you. Until then, happy cooking.